Welcome to Stifel's Sightlines podcast, focusing each week on a topic or two important to investors. Well, greetings and welcome to the Sightlines podcast. This is Michael O'Keefe, Stifel's Chief Investment Officer. Hey, at the risk of being somewhat redundant, I want to bring back into this session a discussion about the fiscal transition or trajectory that the U.S. government's on, in good part because it's really coming into the spotlight a bit more among industry and in some ways government leaders. There's just a lot of focus on it these days, which is good, right? We've been talking about this idea of too much debt, higher interest rates, higher cost of debt for quite a while. So to see folks really starting to bring it into focus is great. And I felt that it would be good to kind of resurface the topic and dig in a little bit more as it relates to sort of what's going on and some additional concepts. So just to review, we know that the debt for the U.S. government has grown a lot since before the Great Recession. I think in the neighborhood of $9 trillion as a debt level in 2006. Probably felt like a lot back then. But basically it's quadrupled since then. So it sits at about $36 trillion. And as interest rates have risen, even though some debt remains outstanding at lower coupon rates, the bottom line is the cost of our debt is going up. So the interest payments that we're paying equal about 50% of the remaining discretionary budget. So think of it as a significant portion that ultimately erodes from our discretionary budget. Another way to think about it is if the debt went away and we didn't have those interest payments, our discretionary budget would grow by about 50%. And so, again, it's a significant component of our government's budget and spending. And unfortunately, the forecasts are for that to continue. So the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, forecasts that our debt is going to, and I'm going to give you a range here, be somewhere between, in round numbers, $56 and $61 trillion 10 years from now, so at the end of 2034. Both very alarming levels. Now, why a range? Well, this is the range that's being sort of surfaced to try to unpack the current omnibus proposal that's making its way through Congress. And there, you kind of hear a significant debate. Oh, if we extend tax cuts, et cetera, then the deficit's going to go up. And so people will focus on that higher number or talk about the delta, $5 trillion. But the reality is both numbers are quite significant. They're both kind of alarming levels, especially when you couple those numbers with the cost of debt, the idea that interest rates are higher. They're expected to stay higher, and to service that debt, basically more and more and more of our spending is going to have to go to simply paying the interest. And it is notable that a growing number of industry leaders are calling for a greater focus on the problem. So Jamie Dimon, J.P. Morgan, Chase has been very vocal about it. I'll give you one quote. He said, quote, "The rising U.S. national debt is a real problem. I don't know if it's 6 months or 6 years, but one day the bond markets will crack," end quote. And then, of course, renowned investor Warren Buffett at Berkshire Hathaway said, quote, "We're operating at a fiscal deficit that is unsustainable over a very long period of time," end quote. So obviously, we've got more and more people talking about it. And yet, the idea of fiscal discipline, what's needed to kind of get us back on track, is super unappealing politically, as we've discussed before. And so I've been sort of asking experts that I meet with, people that I have the good fortune to meet with, and to kind of dig into it and say, what would happen, what would have to happen for this to come into focus for politicians? And the answer, first order answer is, well, it needs to matter to voters. Okay, well, what's going to make it matter to voters? And basically the answer is it's going to have to be pain. In other words, it could be a debt crisis. You could see a big jump in interest rates, a real big jump in interest rates that would translate to a significant decline in the value of bond investments. And it's usually in that kind of circumstance, stocks go down as well. So if there's like this crisis-driven, essentially erosion in portfolio value, that may be a catalyst to get people to start caring about this as voters that would in turn have an influence on politicians. Now, I've said many times before that I remain a bit optimistic as it relates to the potential to solve this problem. And in some ways, when you look at the quote-unquote math of the problem, the issues are really kind of simple, right? You need to either raise taxes, cut spending. You could, in theory, I guess, print money. You could default on the debt, or you could try to grow, or you could try to grow your economy faster to help solve the debt problem. And so I mentioned before, as it relates to the political environment, spending cuts really aren't popular right now. I hope they become more popular, but they're just not popular right now. A significant increase in taxes can help solve the problem by bringing in new revenues. Of course, that's money right out of the pockets of individuals, so that's kind of impactful. And then as well, I think the higher the taxes, the more dampening that can be on economic growth. Now, even though, we've had the Treasury Secretary say, well, we're not going to default on our debt, I think it's important to keep in focus who's impacted if that were to occur. And while we have a lot of different types of debt holders, a significant debt holder are individuals through mutual funds, in their 401ks, in their normal investments, et cetera. So, it's the same thing. If there was a default, part of the harmed party would be individual investors, which is, of course, our focus. And then finally, I think that in terms of focusing on how to solve the problem, the idea of, measured reduced spending in government, I think that's feasible if we can get people focused on it. And then, if you think about economic growth driving higher earnings that then could drive higher taxes, that would be a path, right? Higher economic growth translating to higher levels of earnings, translating to higher tax revenue. So that's good. But I also think we have to be realistic to recognize that we'll want a balanced set of tax policies that do bring in revenue, but at the same time, it needs to be in balance to support private investment and the growth that we just talked about. So anyway, it's almost like painting this picture that, hey, we've got an issue that needs attention. It's been in the media a little bit recently. We see a lot of industry leaders talking about the issue. And so I felt it probably helpful to kind of take this session and dive into the topic a little bit. So really want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this session. Know that we're hard at work, and we'll be back to you next week with another topic. Thank you so much.
Thanks again for listening to Stifel's Sightlines. Be sure to subscribe wherever you're listening to automatically receive each week's podcast in your feed.